In late 1943, the Central Pacific became the meeting point of long-term plans and recent battlefield developments. For more than 2 decades, naval staff officers in Washington had discussed a hypothetical war with Japan under War Plan Orange, which envisioned a methodical advance across the Central Pacific through mandated islands toward the Western Pacific. At the same time, Japanese planners had used their League of Nations mandate over the Marshalls, Carolines, and Marianas to establish a forward zone of bases intended to shield the home islands and sever sea routes between North America, Australia, and Southeast Asia. The Gilbert Islands, a chain of low coral atolls astride the equator, lay between these two strategic constellations. Before the war, they formed part of the British Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony, administered mainly for copra production and phosphate shipping, with a population of tens of thousands of Micronesian islanders and a small group of European officials and traders. Their position, north and west of American-controlled islands such as Howland and Baker, and south and east of the Japanese Marshalls, gave them disproportionate military value as waypoints for aircraft and surface forces. 3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, an Imperial Japanese Navy force under Admiral Kiyohide Shima moved to secure this gap. In Operation Gi, Special Naval Landing Force detachments landed on Makin and Tarawa on 9th to 10th December 1941, meeting no organized resistance, and within days had established a seaplane base in the lagoon at Makin. Subsequent landings extended Japanese control to other northern atolls and suppressed the New Zealand Coastwatcher network that had reported shipping movements before the war. The Gilberts were initially treated as an extension of the Marshall Islands garrison, but as the front shifted north and east, Tokyo recognized their growing importance. During 1942 and early 1943, the wider balance in the Pacific changed. The Guadalcanal and Bunagona campaigns and operations in New Guinea and the Solomons absorbed large ground and air forces from both coalitions. While Japanese army formations tried to stabilize a defensive line through New Guinea and the Solomons, the Imperial Navy faced attrition in carriers, cruisers, and trained air crews. For the United States, the same campaigns demonstrated that industrial output and shipping were now sufficient to sustain more than one major offensive axis. American planners began translating War Plan Orange concepts into simultaneous advances. General Douglas MacArthur along the New Guinea-Philippines route, and Admiral Chester Nimitz across the Central Pacific through the Gilberts and Marshalls. As these plans matured, the Gilberts evolved from a secondary to a primary objective. On Tarawa Atoll, Japanese engineers concentrated on Betio, a small islet at the atoll's western edge. There they constructed Hawkins Field, a compact airstrip that extended Japanese air patrols into the Central Pacific and could host bombers or fighters covering the Marshalls. On Makin, work proceeded on a seaplane base capable of supporting long-range Kawanishi, H-8K flying boats, and other float planes to watch Allied movements between Hawaii, the Ellice Islands, and the South Pacific. These facilities were supplied across long sea routes from Truk and Kwajalein, tying the atolls into the broader Japanese perimeter, but also exposing them to submarine and air attack. The garrisons that protected these installations reflected Japanese strategic priorities and constraints. Responsibility for the Gilberts shifted in 1943 from the 6th Base Force at Kwajalein to a newly formed 3rd Special Base Force headquartered at Betio, commanded by successive rear admirals with combined authority over the Gilberts, Nauru, and Ocean Island. Infantry and coastal artillery units from Special Naval Landing Forces, supported by construction troops and conscripted laborers from Japan and Korea, were instructed to fortify positions and delay any Allied assault as long as possible. The concept was to trade time for strategic depth, buying months for the reinforcement of inner zones, such as the Marianas and Palau, with minimal expectation of relief. From the perspective of local islanders, these changes transformed daily life. Traditional subsistence and copra production were overshadowed by military labor demands, restrictions on movement, and food requisitioning. British officials and many Europeans had been evacuated earlier in the war, leaving communities under Japanese military rule, which imposed curfews, censorship, and forced work on airfields, bunkers, and coastal defenses. Coast watchers who remained, particularly in more remote atolls, faced the risk of arrest or execution if detected transmitting information to Allied forces. On the American side, intelligence about the Gilberts came from multiple sources. A submarine-borne Marine raid on Makin in August 1942 provided reconnaissance on defenses, but also prompted Japanese reinforcements and accelerated fortification efforts. Signals intelligence from code-breaking centers indicated the growth of air and naval installations, while aerial photography from new bases in the Ellis Islands documented runways, gun positions, and supply dumps. By mid-1943, staff at Nimitz's headquarters in Pearl Harbor estimated that any amphibious assault on Tarawa and Makin would meet organized resistance, including coastal guns and prepared infantry positions, rather than the light forces encountered in earlier landings. American domestic opinion formed another element of the preconditions for Operation Galvanic. After nearly 2 years of war in the Pacific, news of battles in remote jungles and seas underscored the conflict's scale, but gave little sense of progress toward Japan. Political leaders and senior commanders saw a Central Pacific offensive as a way to apply growing carrier, battleship, and amphibious strength in a direct advance toward the Japanese homeland, while also supporting the ongoing campaigns in the Southwest Pacific by threatening Japan's oceanic supply lines. By the autumn of 1943, both coalitions had therefore assigned strategic weight to a group of low coral atolls whose pre-war significance had been local and economic. For Tokyo, the Gilberts formed the outer edge of a multi-layered shield whose loss would expose the Marshalls and weaken the concept of an absolute national defense zone farther west. For Washington and London, they were a necessary first rung in a ladder of bases leading to the Marshalls, Carolines, and ultimately the Marianas, from which heavy bombers could reach Japanese cities. Operation Galvanic would be the attempt to resolve these competing expectations through simultaneous amphibious assaults on Tarawa, Makin, and Abemama in November 1943. In mid-1943, the Pacific War reached a transition point in which planning turned into concrete orders. After the capture of Guadalcanal and progress along the New Guinea coast, the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized a Central Pacific offensive to complement advances in the Southwest Pacific. The decision placed the Gilberts at the start of a sequence of operations whose timing would be synchronized with land campaigns in New Guinea and the Solomons. The choice of the Gilberts reflected both geography and available forces. They lay within range of new bomber fields in the Ellis Islands and could be attacked with the growing carrier strength assembled at Pearl Harbor. Within this framework, Admiral Chester Nimitz, as Commander-in-Chief Pacific Ocean Areas, assigned execution of the operation to Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Central Pacific Force, soon redesignated the Fifth Fleet Spruance's task organization, combined fast carrier groups, older battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and a large amphibious force. Amphibious shipping and landings fell under Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, whose 5th Amphibious Force would coordinate transports, landing craft, naval gunfire, and logistics. Ground combat troops would be controlled by the V Amphibious Corps under Marine Lieutenant General Holland Smith, linking naval and ground command structures in a joint hierarchy. The assault forces were tailored to separate objectives within the Gilberts. For Tarawa, the main effort, V Amphibious Corps designated the 2nd Marine Division, commanded by Major General Julian Smith, with regimental landing teams organized for successive assault waves. The division, with attached units, fielded more than 18,000 personnel for the operation. For Makin, responsibility went to the 27th Infantry Division of the United States Army under Major General Ralph Smith, with roughly 6,000 to 7,000 troops assigned to the initial landing echelon. A smaller detachment from 2nd Marine Division was earmarked to secure Abemama. These allocations reflected assessments of Japanese garrison strength and terrain at each atoll. On the Japanese side, the Gilberts were part of a broader defensive zone controlled from the Marshalls. Overall naval responsibility rested with the 4th Fleet and local base forces headquartered at Kwajalein. At Tarawa, the key position was Betio, commanded by Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki. He directed a garrison consisting of Special Naval Landing Force infantry, coastal defense artillery, anti-aircraft units, and construction troops, reinforced by laborers from Japan and Korea. At Makin, a smaller detachment of naval troops, supported by base personnel and local labor, maintained the seaplane base and coastal positions. Their orders emphasized holding out as long as possible, with limited prospect of reinforcement once a major enemy fleet appeared offshore. As the opening phase approached, both coalitions concentrated shipping and aircraft. In Hawaii, Samoa, and the Ellis Islands, American transports, cargo ships, and landing ships assembled in staging areas where troops conducted practice landings and rehearsed coordination between infantry, tanks, engineers, and naval gunfire liaison teams. Heavy equipment, including amphibious tractors, medium tanks, artillery, and supplies for sustained operations ashore, was loaded into a carefully sequenced embarkation plan designed to deliver assault waves, follow-on echelons, and service troops in order. Carrier air groups trained for close air supports, reconnaissance, and suppression of coastal batteries, refining procedures that had evolved during earlier campaigns. Japanese commanders monitored these developments through reconnaissance and radio intelligence, but faced uncertainty about the precise objective. Air searches from bases in the Marshalls and outer islands occasionally sighted Allied convoys or aircraft, yet the rapid expansion of American logistics hubs in the Ellis Islands and elsewhere made it difficult to distinguish feints from genuine preparations. At the same time, shipping shortages and competing demands from New Guinea, the Solomons, and the Central Pacific limited their ability to shift major reinforcements into the Gilberts. Available measures included strengthening existing fortifications, redistributing limited aircraft to forward fields, and issuing alerts to garrisons to prepare for air attack. The first visible signs of Operation Galvanic at the front line came not from troop landings, but from air and naval strikes. In mid-November 1943, fast carrier task groups moved west of the Ellis Islands and launched raids against Tarawa, Makin, and nearby bases. Carrier aircraft attacked airstrips, seaplane facilities, and coastal positions, while also attempting to destroy any Japanese aircraft able to contest control of the air. Japanese responses, where possible, included anti-aircraft fire from ground units and limited bomber sorties from more distant bases seeking to locate and strike the carrier groups. These exchanges marked a shift from the relative quiet that had followed earlier raids to a sustained pre-invasion bombardment. Submarines and long-range patrol aircraft extended this opening phase at sea. American submarines intensified attacks on shipping routes between the Marshalls and the Gilberts, aiming to isolate the targeted atolls and prevent the arrival of reinforcements or supplies in the days before the landings. Patrol bombers from newly established bases in the Ellis Islands and elsewhere flew reconnaissance and occasional bombing missions against lagoon anchorages and nearby waters. For Japanese commanders, reports of submarine attacks and air raids underscored that an offensive was underway, but did not yet clarify the precise timing or landing beaches. By 19th November 1943, the American invasion convoys had closed on their objectives. Transports and landing ships formed approach columns under escorting cruisers and destroyers, while battleships and additional cruisers maneuvered into positions from which to deliver sustained gunfire. During the night, final briefings on board ships translated the operational plan into individual unit tasks for the coming day. At dawn, on the 20th of November, heavy naval gunfire against Betio and Makin signaled that Operation Galvanic had moved from preparations and probing attacks into direct assault on the Japanese garrisons of the Gilbert Islands. Strategic planning for Operation Galvanic linked the capture of specific atolls to a wider calendar of offensives in 1944. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff set a timetable in which the seizure of bases in the Gilberts would allow follow-on attacks against the Marshalls within weeks, and against the Carolines and Marianas later in the year. The goal was to create a chain of airfields and anchorages that would support long-range bombing, submarine operations, and convoy routes while progressively reducing Japanese capacity to move ships and aircraft across the Central Pacific. Time estimates for airfield construction, depot building, and repair facilities were integrated with the schedule of future operations, so that each captured island would be in use shortly after combat ended. At theater level, planners at Pearl Harbor translated these broad objectives into concrete requirements. They calculated the number of carrier task groups, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and transports needed not only to land assault forces, but also to sustain them under possible counterattack. Fuel consumption for the fleet, ammunition expenditure for naval gunfire and carrier sorties, and replacement stocks for aircraft and landing craft were estimated and loaded into a sequence of supply convoys. Engineers determined how many construction battalions, bulldozers, cranes, and tons of steel matting would be needed to restore or expand runways on Tarawa and Makin and to build new installations on other islets. Amphibious doctrine shaped how these resources would be used. The plan divided the operation into approach, assault, and build-up phases. During the assault, infantry units would land in successive waves, supported by tanks, combat engineers, naval gunfire, and close air support from carriers and land-based aircraft. Detailed tables specified the order in which landing craft would approach the beaches, the intervals between waves, and the types of units in each. Specialized amphibious tractors were assigned to carry the first waves across the lagoon reef, while conventional landing craft would follow once the tide permitted. Planners assumed that a combination of bombardment and surprise would reduce organized resistance on the landing beaches to a level manageable by the first wave. Intelligence estimates underpin these assumptions but contain significant uncertainties. Aerial photography and submarine reports were used to produce maps of Betio and Makin, identifying gun positions, trenches, and probable command posts. Analysts estimated garrison strength on Tarawa at roughly 2,500 to 3,000 men, with fewer on Makin, and concluded that the defenders were primarily naval infantry and construction troops. These figures were used to design the size of assault forces and to calculate expected ammunition requirements. Hydrographic surveys of the lagoons and reefs based on peacetime charts, limited reconnaissance, and tide tables suggested that tides would be sufficient on the chosen dates for landing craft to cross the reef after preliminary bombardment. Japanese planning began from different premises and constraints. Central directives for the outer island defenses instructed garrisons to organize their positions for all-round resistance and to inflict maximum casualties in the first hours of an enemy landing. On Betio, this translated into a belt of coastal guns, machine gun positions, and bunkers aligned to cover likely approach routes across the reef. And beaches, defensive works were grouped into mutually supporting strongpoints, each designed to continue fighting even if isolated. The single airstrip, fuel dumps, and communications posts were surrounded by secondary defenses to resist attacks that penetrated the beach line. Limited concrete and steel-led engineers to use coral, timber, and sand, creating low silhouettes that blended into the atoll's profile. Logistically, Japanese planners had to assume that once a major enemy fleet appeared, resupply by surface ship would be hazardous. Stocks of ammunition, food, and fuel were therefore accumulated in dispersed storage pits and small dumps across the islets. The seaplane base and airstrip were intended to provide reconnaissance and limited air support, but the number of available aircraft and trained air crews was restricted by competing demands from other fronts. Instructions to commanders emphasized endurance rather than expectation of relief. The value assigned to the atolls was in the delay and attrition they could impose on an advancing enemy rather than their long-term retention. Both sides prepared for the human consequences of combat on populated islands. American planners anticipated that local civilians, including islanders and non-combatant laborers, would be present on some atolls. Orders directed assault units and naval commanders to establish collection points, provide medical care, and separate civilians from active combat zones. When possible, Japanese directives, facing an eventuality in which evacuation of non-essential personnel might not be possible, included guidance on dispersing laborers and support staff into less exposed areas of the atolls and on maintaining order under bombardment and possible isolation. Miscalculations were embedded in these plans. American reliance on pre-war hydrographic data and limited in-theater reconnaissance left uncertainties about reef depth and tidal patterns that would become critical during the landings. Estimates of Japanese defensive strength and the expected effects of naval bombardment assumed a degree of target neutralization that contemporary gunnery theory suggested, but did not guarantee against hardened or deeply buried positions. Japanese planners, for their part, faced incomplete information about the scale and composition of the attacking force, and had to distribute their limited heavy guns and anti-aircraft weapons in patterns that might or might not match actual assault axes. As convoys and task forces moved into position in November 1943, these strategic goals and planning assumptions on both sides would be tested against the realities of weather, terrain, and combat on the reefs and beaches of the Gilbert Islands. At dawn on the 20th of November 1943, the opening bombardment on Betio and Butaritari shifted from preliminary raids to concentrated fire. Off Tarawa, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fired systematically at mapped gun positions, runway installations, and suspected command posts on Betio. Columns of spray and smoke rose along the southern shore of the islet, temporarily obscuring landmarks that Marine shore party officers needed for navigation. On-board transports, assault units waited according to embarkation tables, moving into landing craft and amphibious tractors as signal flags, and loudspeakers relayed timing adjustments from higher command. For Japanese troops on Betio, the first hours of bombardment meant confinement to bunkers, trenches, and shelters dug into coral and sand. Prearranged orders instructed crews of coastal guns and anti-aircraft weapons to cease fire and take cover once it became clear that they were under systematic naval attack, then to re-emerge when enemy landing craft closed within effective range. Underground command posts monitored telephone lines and visual signals. Assessing damage and confirming which gun positions remained functional, laborers and non-combatant personnel moved deeper into the interior of the island where possible, while some local islanders and workers sought shelter in pits and natural depressions away from the main defensive belt. As the bombardment lifted according to the planned schedule, the first assault waves of the 2nd Marine Division began their run toward Betio's southern beaches in amphibious tractors. The LVTs carried rifle companies, machine gun teams, and small engineer detachments tasked with breaching obstacles. Behind them, conventional landing craft carrying later waves waited near the line of departure, timed to cross the reef once the tide permitted. Initial assumptions that naval fire had neutralized most coastal guns were quickly tested when surviving Japanese batteries and machine gun positions reopened fire, engaging the advancing formations from frontal and flanking angles. Hydrographic uncertainties immediately influenced the first engagements. The tide over the southern reef remained lower than anticipated. Amphibious tractors with tracked hulls could climb over the exposed coral and continue toward the lagoon beaches, but many Higgins boats grounded several hundred meters offshore. Marines in these craft disembarked into chest-deep water and began wading toward the beach under fire. The spacing of waves and the location of sandbars created irregular clusters of troops, some reaching the beach with intact unit cohesion, others arriving as mixed groups of companies and platoons that had lost officers or equipment. En route radio operators and shore fire control parties tried to re-establish contact with naval gunfire ships to request adjustments on active enemy positions. On Makin, the initial landings of the 27th Infantry Division faced a different tactical environment. The approach to Butaritari Island allowed landing craft to move closer to the beaches without encountering the same reef conditions seen at Tarawa. Pre-landing bombardment from ships and aircraft had targeted known coastal gun sites, supply areas, and probable troop concentrations. When the first waves came ashore, they met sporadic fire and discovered that some Japanese positions near the main landing sectors had been abandoned or destroyed. However, uncertainty remained about the location and strength of inland defenses, and patrols pushed forward cautiously to secure the seaplane base, ammunition dumps, and road junctions. From the Japanese perspective, these opening contacts reflected the logic of their defensive plans. On Betio, systems of interlocking fields of fire along the southern shore were designed to exploit any disruption in enemy landing formations. Machine gun teams, riflemen, and gunners in bunkers waited for assault troops to emerge from the shallows, then concentrated fire on groups that had become separated or were clustered behind limited cover along the beach. Observers relayed target data to mortars and light artillery pieces, which attempted to strike assembly areas forming just beyond the waterline. On Makin, smaller detachments used vegetation and narrow causeways to delay infantry advances, trading ground for time. The first hours ashore imposed immediate logistical and medical demands on the assault forces. Waterlogged radios, damaged landing craft, and losses among specialist personnel complicated coordination. Improvised aid stations formed near the beaches where Navy corpsmen and Army medics treated wounded from multiple units. Engineers and shore party troops began marking channels, clearing obstacles, and organizing ammunition and supply dumps under intermittent fire. Amphibious tractor crews shuttled between ships and shore, bringing in additional waves of infantry and supporting weapons while evacuating wounded on return trips. Civilian and non-combatant experiences during these early engagements varied by location. On Betio, the concentration of defenses and bombardment on a confined islet meant that shelters and work areas near military installations were exposed to naval and air fire. Some laborers and islanders were caught in crossfire or blast effects despite attempts to disperse them before the bombardment. On Butaratari, where the Japanese garrison and facilities were more dispersed, certain village areas initially lay outside the main axis of fighting, though movement and access to food and water were restricted as both forces established control over key points along the island's length. Commanders at sea and in rear headquarters monitored these first reports with attention to indicators of success or failure in their planning assumptions. For American naval and corps staff, key questions included whether sufficient troops had reached the designated beachheads to form continuous lines, whether naval gunfire and air support could still be directed effectively at intact defensive positions, and whether supply flow from ship to shore was adequate to sustain the next phase of the operation. For Japanese higher commands receiving fragmentary signals from the atolls, early messages about bombardment intensity and enemy landings had to be interpreted alongside incomplete radar and reconnaissance information to assess whether the Gilberts were the primary objective or part of a broader offensive along the defensive perimeter. By the end of the first day, the clash had moved beyond the waterline into partially secured footholds, isolated strong points, and contested interior areas. The opening engagements of Operation Galvanic had tested hydrographic data, amphibious doctrine, and defensive fortifications, and had begun to define the patterns of combat that would shape the subsequent escalation on both Tarawa and Makin. As the first day of landings ended, both sides entered a period of uncertainty and strain. On Betio, the 2nd Marine Division held a series of narrow, discontinuous footholds along the southern shore, separated by stretches of beach still under Japanese control. Some companies had been reduced to a fraction of their starting strength, and several tanks lay disabled on the reef or along the waterline. Communications between battalions and between shore parties and naval gunfire support remained inconsistent, because many radios had been submerged or damaged during the approach command posts ashore, and afloat compiled fragmentary reports to estimate how much of the island was actually held. Nightfall brought a new phase of fighting. Japanese doctrine for island defense called for local counterattacks to restore broken lines or exploit gaps. On Betio, surviving officers organized groups of infantry and engineers around remaining strongpoints, probing toward the Marine positions under cover of darkness. Tracer fire, flares, and the limited use of artillery marked shifting contact lines, while both sides relied increasingly on hand grenades, automatic weapons, and close-range engagements in and around partially destroyed bunkers and trenches. In some sectors, improvised defensive perimeters formed around stranded tanks, wrecked landing craft, or piles of ammunition boxes. For the Marines and attached Navy personnel, the night emphasized logistical and medical challenges. Casualty evacuation across the reef and lagoon in darkness was hazardous. Corpsmen and stretcher teams worked along the beach to move wounded into makeshift aid posts, where surgeons operated under lamps powered by portable generators. ammunition and water stocks in forward positions had to be redistributed by hand because vehicle movement was limited in narrow, contested corridors between the shore and the airstrip. The heat and humidity of the atoll environment, combined with exposure and seawater immersion, began to affect the condition of men who had been in the surf or shallow foxholes since morning. On Makin, the situation developed differently, but still presented crises of coordination. Initial landings had encountered less organized resistance than expected, leading some units to advance inland faster than neighboring elements. This created intervals in the line where Japanese detachments could move or hide. The 27th Infantry Division had to balance the desire for rapid capture of the seaplane base and key installations with the need to clear bypass positions. Occasional sniper fire, small counterattacks, and uncertainty about the size of the remaining garrison slowed the advance. Night operations on Butaritari were complicated by vegetation, narrow roads, and concerns about identifying friend and foe in low visibility. At sea, commanders weighed the risk of maintaining large concentrations of ships near shallow anchorages. The possibility of Japanese air or submarine attack remained a factor in decisions about the duration and intensity of naval gunfire and the positioning of carriers and battleships. Escorts maintained anti-submarine patrols around the transport areas, and radar picket destroyers watched for incoming aircraft. Each additional day of operations in the Gilberts consumed fuel and ammunition at rates that had been calculated in advance but were now being tested against actual expenditure and the evolving tactical situation. Japanese higher headquarters in the Marshalls and farther west monitored the battle through intermittent reports. Messages from Betio and Makin described heavy bombardment, landings, and continuing resistance, but often lacked precise information about enemy strength or the status of individual units. The distances involved, combined with American air and naval activity along likely reinforcement routes, constrained options for direct intervention. Plans for counterattack by surface forces were limited by the presence of carrier task groups, while available aircraft in the region had to cover multiple threatened sectors. As a result, the garrisons largely fought with the resources already on the atolls. Civilian and laborer experiences during this escalation phase reflected the same fragmentation seen in military operations. On Betio, those who had taken shelter near Japanese positions found themselves exposed to continued shelling and close combat as both sides struggled for control of strongpoints. Some groups moved repeatedly between shelters as lines shifted by hundreds of meters, while access to food, water, and medical care became increasingly uncertain. On Butaritari, communities near the main road network and seaplane base were drawn into the fighting as American units advanced. Others remained temporarily behind the lines, subject to movement controls imposed first by Japanese, then by American authorities. Psychological pressures increased on all participants. For assault troops, the contrast between expectations of a brief, overwhelming bombardment and the reality of continued organized resistance created concern about the viability of future operations against even more heavily fortified atolls. For Japanese defenders, the scale of the fleet and air power off the atolls underlined the limited probability of relief, reinforcing orders to fight until positions were physically overrun. Senior commanders in both coalitions recognized that the manner in which the crisis on these small islands was resolved would influence not only the immediate tactical outcome, but also future planning for operations deeper into the Central Pacific. By the morning of the 21st of November, combat on Betio had concentrated into a series of dense engagements around the airstrip and central strongpoints. Elements of the 2nd Marine Division that had secured beachheads on the southern shore now pushed inland toward the runway, moving through belts of wrecked positions and intact bunkers, fire lanes from surviving Japanese machine gun nests, and anti-tank guns cut across open ground, forcing advances by short rushes between shell holes and fragments of seawalls. Tanks and amphibious tractors, where still operational, were used as mobile cover and as direct fire platforms against reinforced pillboxes. The capture and use of the airstrip became a central objective and symbol of progress. Once Marines reached portions of the runway, they established firing positions on either side, creating a corridor that divided Japanese defenders on the eastern and western sectors of the islet. This split limited the ability of the garrison to coordinate counterattacks, but strong points remained active near the ends of the strip and along coastal flanks. Engineers worked alongside infantry, placing demolition charges against bunker apertures, while riflemen and machine gunners covered them from close range. In many cases, the reduction of a single position required repeated attacks and adjustments in supporting fire. Japanese troops inside the remaining defensive complexes adapted their tactics to the shrinking perimeter. Small groups maneuvered through communication trenches and crawl tunnels to launch short-range counterattacks, or to reoccupy partially cleared positions. Command posts that retained functioning field telephones relayed information on Marine concentrations and requested mortar or artillery fire from guns still intact in the interior. Coastal batteries that had survived earlier bombardment shifted from engaging ships and landing craft to direct fire against advancing infantry, using prearranged range data on landmarks visible from their casemates. On Makin, the 27th Infantry Division advanced along the length of Butari-Tari, pressing from initial landing areas toward the seaplane base and remaining Japanese positions in the western sector. Patrols probed coconut groves, drainage ditches, and small villages where resistance could be concealed. The garrison, fewer in number than on Betio, relied on ambushes, demolitions, and limited counterattacks to delay the American advance. As road junctions, piers, and storage sites were occupied by infantry and engineers, the capacity of the defenders to maneuver and resupply contracted. By the second day, organized resistance on much of the island had given way to isolated pockets. At sea, the intensity of operations reached its own peak. Carrier air groups flew continuous sorties for close support, reconnaissance, and combat air patrols. Shipboard anti-aircraft crews remained at their stations for extended periods, responding to any radar contact that might indicate a Japanese airstrike. On the 24th of November, the loss of the escort carrier Liscum Bay to a torpedo from a Japanese submarine highlighted the vulnerability of the fleet despite strong escorts. Hundreds of personnel aboard the carrier were killed when aviation fuel and bomb stowage detonated. A concentration of casualties in a single incident that equaled or exceeded the daily losses of some ground units. For naval and amphibious staff, such events forced immediate reassessment of risk versus operational necessity. Decisions had to be taken on how long to maintain large ships within range of shore-based guns and submarines, and whether to adjust the schedule of unloading and gunfire support. Yet the need to sustain ground combat, evacuate wounded, and land engineers and supplies limited the scope for rapid withdrawal. Tankers and ammunition ships cycled through designated areas to replenish capital ships and destroyers, while tugs and repair vessels dealt with damaged landing craft and smaller ships. Civilian and laborer conditions on the atolls reached a critical point during this phase. On Betio, the proximity of almost all inhabited areas to major defensive positions meant that few locations escaped shelling, or small arms fire groups of workers from Japan and Korea and islanders who had been employed on fortification work found themselves in underground shelters or improvised dugouts with diminishing stocks of water and food. On Butari-Tari, some villages experienced occupation by both sides in sequence as front lines moved past, leading to repeated searches, requisitions of supplies, and the temporary use of local buildings as aid posts or command centers. High command decisions during these days reflected both tactical reports and broader strategic calculations. For American leaders, confirmation that organized resistance on Makin was collapsing allowed consideration of reassigning certain naval units and air assets toward preparation for the next phase in the Marshalls. On Tarawa, by contrast, the persistence of fighting in parts of Betio required continued commitment of ships, aircraft, and fresh companies from afloat reserves Japanese regional headquarters, receiving fewer messages as positions were overrun and communications cut, shifted from planning reinforcement to revising defensive schemes for inner lines, assuming that the Gilberts would eventually be lost. Morale and endurance became key variables in this peak period. Units that had landed in the first wave on Betio had been in near continuous combat for more than a day. With limited opportunity for rest, rear areas were confined to narrow strips of sand behind still contested zones, so rotation of companies to less exposed positions was difficult. Japanese defenders, operating within ever smaller sectors, faced a continuous cycle of bombardment and assault, with little prospect of relief or organized withdrawal. The outcome of Operation Galvanic now depended on whether the remaining fortified pockets could be reduced before the cost in ships and men affected plans for the wider Central Pacific campaign. As organized resistance on Makin diminished and the battle on Betio entered its third day, both sides adjusted their methods to changing conditions. The 2nd Marine Division reorganized its fragmented beachhead into more continuous lines, linking previously isolated footholds along the southern shore and across the airstrip company, and battalion commanders reallocated platoons, machine gun sections, and remaining tanks to eliminate gaps, creating small combined arms teams that could advance systematically from one strong point to the next. Fire support coordination centers ashore refined procedures for calling naval gunfire and artillery onto specific bunker complexes, using ground observers and aerial spotting. Japanese forces on Betio adapted from a perimeter defense to a network of isolated resistance centers. As communications between sectors broke down, local leaders assumed greater autonomy, organizing small groups in remaining bunkers, trenches, and shell holes. Movement shifted to underground routes and night infiltrations, aiming to disrupt marine positions, strike aid posts or command points, and then withdraw before daylight ammunition and food were redistributed within each cluster, with surviving stocks concentrated at positions judged most likely to delay further advances. Plans for larger night counterattacks gathered men from dispersed remnants into ad hoc formations. American infantry, engineers, and armor adjusted their tactics to this pattern of resistance. Assaults increasingly followed a sequence of encirclement, suppression, and demolition. Units sought to bypass intact bunkers sufficiently to isolate them, then used flamethrowers, satchel charges, and direct fire from tanks or anti-tank guns to neutralize firing ports and entrances. Communications improved as new radios were brought ashore, and field telephone lines were laid along the island's length, allowing closer synchronization between infantry advances and supporting fires. Liaison teams from naval gunfire ships visited forward command posts to clarify target grids and reduce delays between requests and salvos. On Makin, the 27th Infantry Division shifted from broad front advances to methodical sweeps through remaining pockets of resistance. Patrols used aerial photographs, prisoner interrogation, and information from local inhabitants to map suspected hiding places in vegetation and along drainage lines. Engineers cleared obstacles on the main road and at the seaplane base, enabling vehicles to carry supplies forward and evacuate wounded. When Japanese groups were located, infantry commanders increasingly preferred to use encirclement and firepower rather than frontal assaults in close terrain, reflecting experience gained during the first days of the operation. Non-combatant populations also adapted to the evolving situation. On Buteritari, villagers negotiated new patterns of movement as American forces established control over roads, piers, and storage areas. Temporary camps and collection points were created where islanders and foreign laborers could be assembled for identification, questioning, and medical inspection. And Betio, opportunities for organized civilian movement were limited by the concentration of fighting, but wherever possible, medical personnel from both sides extended treatment to wounded non-combatants encountered in or near combat zones. These interactions influenced local perceptions of both garrisons and invading forces. Logistical practices evolved under pressure. Shore parties reorganized supply dumps to reduce vulnerability to shelling and accidental fires, dividing ammunition, fuel, and rations among multiple smaller sites instead of a few large ones. Water purification units and distribution points were pushed closer to forward positions to reduce the distance infantry had to travel under exposure. Disabled landing craft and amphibious tractors were stripped of usable parts and then employed as improvised barriers or firing positions along the beaches. Medical teams adjusted triage procedures, prioritizing cases that could return quickly to duty, while arranging early evacuation of those requiring surgery beyond the capacity of beach aid stations. Japanese commands in the marshals and farther west began to draw lessons from fragmentary reports. Messages from Tarawa and Makin describing the effects of naval bombardment, armored vehicles, and close air support contributed to emerging concepts for deeper, more dispersed defenses on other atolls. Plans emphasized additional use of underground shelters, cave positions where terrain allowed, and deception measures to conceal artillery and command posts from aerial observation. Within the limits of available resources, staff officers considered how to apply these adaptations to the Marshall, Caroline, and Mariana Island groups before similar landings occurred there. American Higher Headquarters likewise treated the ongoing battle as a source of data. Observers recorded the performance of LVTs on reefs, the effectiveness of pre-landing bombardments against different types of fortifications, and the interaction between carrier-based close air support and artillery. Notes on coordination problems, hydrographic errors, and communications failures were compiled even as the fighting continued, with the explicit aim of revising amphibious doctrine and landing plans for forthcoming operations in the Marshalls. For both coalitions, resistance and adaptation during the final days on Makin and Betio thus extended beyond the immediate struggle, influencing doctrines and preparations for the next stages of the Central Pacific Campaign. The turning point on Betio came as remaining Japanese positions contracted into a few sectors at the eastern and western ends of the islet. By 22nd November, Marine units had established a continuous line across the island, with forward elements facing clusters of bunkers, trenches, and debris-filled craters. Commanders coordinated a final series of concentrated attacks, combining infantry, armor, engineers, artillery, and naval gunfire in a sequence aimed at exhausting the last organized resistance. Timetables synchronized preparatory fires with advances, allowing brief pauses for bombardment before assault teams closed in on designated strongpoints. Within the shrinking perimeter, Japanese officers and senior non-commissioned leaders assessed their situation in terms of available personnel, ammunition, and defensible ground communications with higher headquarters had largely ceased, and remaining radios or field telephones were used mainly to coordinate between adjacent positions. Orders emphasized continued resistance and, where feasible, night counterattacks designed to penetrate marine lines or reach supply dumps and command posts. Small groups moved through communication trenches and rubble after dark, attempting to inflict local damage before being cut off by superior numbers and firepower. The final assaults on Betio's remaining centers of resistance often took the form of short, intense engagements over limited areas. In some sectors, Marines used artillery and mortars to suppress visible positions, then advanced behind tanks and flamethrowers that targeted firing apertures and entrances. Engineers emplaced demolition charges at points where overhead cover was thickest. Once a bunker complex fell silent, search parties entered to confirm the status of its occupants, recover documents, and clear any remaining weapons. Incrementally, these methods reduced the network of mutually supporting positions into isolated pockets that could no longer coordinate their fire effectively. On Makin, the turning point had already occurred as organized Japanese resistance collapsed into scattered groups along the western end of Butare-Tari. By 23rd November, American units had secured the seaplane base, key road segments, and storage areas. Systematic sweeps through groves and along waterways located remaining defenders, many of whom engaged briefly before being killed or captured. The capture of documents, including maps and orders, provided additional confirmation that the garrison had been limited in number, and that its capacity to influence the wider campaign had been reduced once the island's facilities passed into American control. For civilian and laborer populations, the transition from active combat to consolidation brought mixed changes. On Betio, the end of major fighting meant that surviving islanders and foreign workers could emerge from shelters more frequently, but they did so in a landscape heavily damaged by bombardment and close combat. American units organized collection points where non-combatants were assembled for identification, medical screening, and provision of basic rations. On Butare-Tari, similar measures were implemented, with additional attention to re-establishing local fishing and transport patterns under new regulations issued by the occupying forces. The declaration that Betio and Makin were secured followed a series of assessments by field and fleet commanders. Ground units reported the absence of organized resistance, the capture or destruction of major defensive installations, and the completion of sweeps through likely hiding places. Naval and air reconnaissance confirmed that no significant enemy formations remained on nearby islets capable of threatening anchorages or airfield construction. Once these conditions were met, higher headquarters announced the end of organized combat operations in the Gilberts, while acknowledging that isolated individuals could still pose local risks. These decisions had immediate operational consequences. Carrier task groups and some battleships received orders to withdraw toward bases where they would refuel, rearm, and prepare for operations against the Marshals. Certain cruisers, destroyers, and smaller vessels remained to support ongoing construction and garrison duties, while transports completed unloading equipment and supplies needed to convert the captured atolls into functioning bases. Ground units began transitioning from assault formations to occupation and construction support roles, reallocating manpower from frontline companies to security details, labor supervision, and engineering tasks. For Japanese regional commands, confirmation that communications with the Gilberts had ceased and that American forces were building airfields on captured atolls signaled that the perimeter had been breached. Reports from surviving aircraft and submarines, together with intercepted communications, indicated the scale of the fleet involved and the speed with which new bases were being established. Staff officers integrated these data into revised threat assessments for the Marshals and other island groups, concluding that further landings would likely follow within months along the same axis. At the level of individual participants, the turning point phase left contrasting impressions. Many American soldiers and Marines understood the end of fighting on Makin and Betio as a practical marker that the first step of the Central Pacific Offensive had succeeded, but also noted the intensity of resistance encountered on relatively small atolls. Japanese survivors, whether captured or evacuated earlier, regarded the loss of the Gilberts as evidence that existing defensive arrangements and available resources were insufficient to halt a well-prepared amphibious assault backed by strong naval and air forces. In both coalitions, these interpretations would inform debates over tactics, training, and priorities for the next stages of the war in the Pacific. End of combat in the Gilberts brought transition rather than immediate stability. On Betio, Marines and Navy personnel began a systematic search of the islet to locate wounded, confirm the status of defensive positions, and clear unexploded ordnance. Medical teams moved through bunker complexes and shell craters, treating surviving Japanese defenders and non-combatants alongside American casualties. Field cemeteries were established for both sides, with temporary markers recording names, unit designations, or, where identification was impossible, simple numerical references for later investigation. Casualty figures illustrated the intensity of the fighting on limited ground. The 2nd Marine Division and attached units suffered more than 3,000 killed and wounded on Tarawa, concentrated over roughly 76 hours of combat on an islet less than 5 square kilometers in area. On Makin, losses for the 27th Infantry Division were lower but still significant given the size of the garrison and the relatively short duration of operations. Japanese fatalities on Betio accounted for most of the approximately 4,700 defenders estimated to have been present, while only a small number of prisoners were taken. At Makin, several hundred Japanese personnel were killed and more than 100 captured, providing information about defensive preparations and higher-level directives. Naval losses formed another part of the withdrawal phase. The sinking of Liscombe Bay with more than 600 men, together with damage to other ships from coastal guns and submarines, required reassessment of escort arrangements and anti-submarine procedures for future amphibious operations. Survivors from the carrier were redistributed among other vessels and later to shore establishments, where their accounts of the torpedo strike and subsequent explosions contributed to analyses of shipboard ammunition, stowage and damage control practices. Occupation and base development began almost immediately. On Betio and surrounding islets, Navy and Marine engineers surveyed the damaged airstrip, piers, and lagoon channels to determine priorities for repair. Rubble from destroyed bunkers and buildings was cleared or repurposed to strengthen revetments and taxiways. Within weeks, aircraft from Navy and Army Air Forces units began to operate from Tarawa, conducting reconnaissance and patrols over the surrounding ocean and toward the Marshalls on Makin. The former seaplane base and new airfield facilities became nodes in a network of staging points for aircraft, surface craft, and logistics convoys moving west. Civil administration in the captured atolls was initially military in character. Commanders issued regulations governing curfews, movement, trade, and fishing, while liaison officers worked with local leaders to restore basic services and food distribution. Foreign laborers brought by the Japanese, including workers from Japan and Korea, were assembled, registered, and gradually repatriated or relocated according to Allied policy and shipping availability. British colonial officials returned to the Gilbert Islands at a later stage, re-establishing civil governance in coordination with American military authorities, and addressing issues such as property claims and wartime collaboration or coercion. For Japanese command structures, the loss of the Gilberts required adjustments in defensive planning and logistics. Supply routes that had once run through the atolls were rerouted or abandoned, and the outer perimeter line on maps shifted inward toward the Marshalls and Caroline's surviving staff, and line officers analyzed reports from the battle, identifying factors such as the concentration of firepower available to American carriers and battleships, the vulnerability of surface reinforcement routes to submarines and aircraft, and the limitations of static coastal defenses once air and sea control had been lost. These assessments informed subsequent directives emphasizing deeper dispersion of positions and increased reliance on underground facilities where geography allowed. On the American side, after action reviews at division, corps, fleet, and joint chiefs, levels drew on unit reports, interviews, and captured documents. Particular attention was given to the performance of amphibious tractors across reefs, the accuracy and duration of naval bombardments, coordination between shipboard and shore-based artillery, and the adequacy of intelligence on tides and fortifications. Recommendations included revisions to hydrographic reconnaissance procedures, expansion of specialized amphibious training, modifications to landing craft load plans, and changes in the mix and timing of pre-landing fires. Humanitarian consequences extended beyond the immediate battlefield. For island communities, the destruction of infrastructure and the interruption of agriculture and fishing required months of reconstruction. Mine clearance and the removal of unexploded shells and bombs became ongoing tasks, with risks to civilians who returned to damaged fields or lagoons. Families of Japanese and American personnel received official notifications shaped by the censored language of wartime communication, often with limited detail about the circumstances of death or capture. For many, the Gilberts remained a distant name on maps, while for those who had fought or lived there, the aftermath of Operation Galvanic meant adapting to altered landscapes, new administrative structures, and the continued presence of war in the Central Pacific. Operation Galvanic left a layered legacy that extended beyond the physical boundaries of the Gilbert Islands. In military terms, it demonstrated that a coalition with carrier groups, amphibious shipping, and industrial backing could force a defended atoll in the face of prepared coastal artillery and infantry fortifications. The sequence from planning to landings, the losses incurred, and the speed with which airfields were restored became a practical proof of concept for the Central Pacific strategy. Subsequent landings in the Marshalls, Carolines, and Marianas drew directly on methods refined at Tarawa and Makin, including longer bombardments, more extensive hydrographic reconnaissance, and expanded use of LVTs to cross reefs. Within American armed forces, debates over the operation's costs shaped doctrine and training. Staff studies compared casualty figures at Tarawa and Makin with earlier and later amphibious assaults, examining correlations between bombardment time, density of defenses, and the ratio of attackers to defenders. Recommendations led to increased emphasis on joint fire support coordination centers, integrated rehearsals for naval gunfire and close air support, and more detailed tide and reef analysis. Amphibious schools incorporated case studies from the Gilberts, using maps, photographs, and veterans' testimonies to teach future officers how to sequence waves, allocate specialized engineer units, and manage logistics on confined islands. For the Japanese side, the fall of the Gilberts contributed to a broader shift in defensive concept, from linear perimeters to what planners called an inner belt, or absolute national defense zone. The experience at Betio and Butaritari reinforced assessments that isolated outer garrisons, once bypassed or directly assaulted by large amphibious forces, could not be reliably resupplied or relieved. Defensive planning for the Marshalls and Marianas therefore placed more weight on depth, dispersal, and underground construction where terrain permitted, and on the expectation that major battles would be fought closer to the home islands. At the same time, the destruction of garrisons in the Gilberts reduced the pool of experienced personnel available to implement these adjustments elsewhere. The operation also had economic and logistical implications. Airfields and anchorages on Tarawa and Makin became nodes in the network supplying later offensives, shortening flight paths for reconnaissance aircraft and patrol bombers, and providing staging areas for convoys carrying troops, fuel, and materiel toward the Marshalls. From the Japanese perspective, the loss of these points diminished their ability to monitor and interdict Allied shipping across the Central Pacific. The gradual shift of sea control in the region affected merchant traffic, submarine operations, and the allocation of scarce fuel and shipping between competing fronts. Civilian and colonial dimensions added further complexity to Galvanic's legacy. For the Gilbertese population, the return of British administration under the protection of American forces meant the re-establishment of pre-war structures within a changed strategic context. Questions about wartime collaboration, coercion of labor, and the distribution of limited aid had to be addressed by colonial officials and local leaders. Korean and Japanese laborers who survived internment or combat carried their experiences back to their home regions after repatriation, where they formed part of wider narratives about forced labor, empire, and defeat in the Pacific. In historiography, Operation Galvanic became a reference point for discussions about the balance between strategic necessity and operational cost. Some analyses emphasize the role of Tarawa and Makin as indispensable first steps in the Central Pacific ladder toward the Marshalls and Marianas, highlighting the time saved compared to alternative routes. Others questioned whether certain heavily fortified atolls needed to be taken directly or could have been bypassed, given the coalition's growing carrier, submarine, and long-range air capabilities. These debates compared Galvanic's casualty patterns with those of later operations, using similar metrics for both sides to assess effectiveness and proportionality. Memory of the operation took different forms among participants and in their respective societies. American veterans of the 2nd Marine Division and 27th Infantry Division, Navy crews, and construction units recalled the reefs, bunkers, and confined battlefields as formative experiences that influenced their views of the Pacific War. Japanese survivors and families of those who died in the Gilberts integrated the battles into wider narratives of island defense, sacrifice, and the limitations of available resources. Gilbert's communities incorporated the events of 1943 into local histories, alongside earlier and later episodes of colonial and post-colonial change. In later decades, Tarawa and Makin appeared in memoirs, official histories, staff college courses, and simulations used for training and research. Analysts used detailed maps and after-action reports to reconstruct sequences of landings, fire missions, and unit movements, comparing the outcomes with contemporary amphibious doctrines. Treatment of civilian experiences, forced labor, and environmental damage expanded as new sources became available, adding perspectives that had been marginal in early accounts focused mainly on military operations. Taken together, these long-term effects situate Operation Galvanic as more than an isolated battle. It functioned as a test of Central Pacific strategy, a catalyst for doctrinal change in both coalitions, a turning point in regional sea and air control, and a disruptive episode in the history of island societies tied to larger imperial systems. The invasion of the Gilbert Islands thus occupies a place in historical analysis where tactical details, strategic calculations, and human experiences intersect, forming part of the broader pattern of the Pacific War's progression, from dispersed campaigns to concentrated operations closer to the Japanese home islands.